Welcome to the Test Management Mindset, insights into the world of software testing. The best content by Practitest in audio form, designed to keep you inspired wherever you are. In today's episode, we're on the topic of solving the integration testing puzzle and the technique of contract testing. Let's get started.
Building software sometimes. Well, it can feel like trying to put together a huge jigsaw puzzle, in the dark.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well.
But what if we could shine a light on those pieces and make sure they all fit together perfectly before we even start putting them together? That's what we're diving into today, contract testing.
It's all about clarity and making sure different parts of your system can actually talk to each other.
So it's like having a clear agreement for every single piece of the puzzle.
Exactly, like a contract, but for software. And this is especially important when you have different teams working on different parts. You know how it is. Sometimes it feels like they're speaking totally different languages.
It's like trying to get those teams to agree on which puzzle to build in the first place.
Right. But seriously, this is where contract testing can really help. Our source material uses the example of a simple address service.
Sounds simple enough, right?
It does, but in the past, testing often meant waiting until the very, very end, when everything was finally built, and then
you cross your fingers and hope it all works together.
pretty much. And as you can imagine, it often led to delays, frustration, and lots of late-night bug hunting.
Yeah, those late nights are never fun. And it makes sense that as the number of components grows, things get exponentially harder.
Absolutely. 10 components, 100 components, even more. The complexity just explodes.
So this is where PACT comes in, this tool we're going to be exploring.
PACT is a game changer. It focuses on testing those individual interactions between the different parts of your system, the consumers and the providers.
Hold on. Back up a bit. Consumers and providers.
Right, so I think of the consumer as the part of the system that needs something, like an address in this case, and the provider as the part that provides it.
Okay, so instead of testing the entire system at once, PACT focuses on how those individual parts interact.
Exactly. It's like making sure each pair of dancers knows their steps before they try to perform the whole ballet together.
Love that analogy.
Yeah.
So how does PACT actually work? I mean, how does it define those expectations between the consumer and the provider?
It all starts with the consumer, actually. Our source material uses a C programming example. Don't worry, you don't need to be a coding whiz to get it.
Phew, that's a relief.
But basically, the consumer says, hey, provider, when I ask for this information, I expect it to look like this, in this specific format.
So it's all about setting clear boundaries from the start. No more guesswork or assumptions.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, PACT takes those expectations and turns them into a testable contract.
Wow, so no more relying on outdated documentation or hoping that everyone is on the same page.
Nope. With PACT, you have those expectations codified.
That's huge.
Yeah.
But what happens when you have a whole bunch of these consumers and providers, each with their own contract? It sounds like it could get pretty complicated.
That's where the PACT broker comes in.
The PACT broker, what's that?
Think of it like a central marketplace where all these contracts live. It's how your different services can find each other, understand each other, and make sure they're compatible.
So it's like a dating service for your software components.
Huh. You could say that. The consumer publishes their expectations, the provider checks if they can meet them, and everyone knows if there's a compatibility issue before things go haywire in production.
This is incredible. So we can catch those integration issues early on before they become major headaches.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning. We'll dive into more of the benefits and some of the challenges of contract testing after a quick break.
Yeah, catching those integration issues early on can save so much time and headache in the long run.
It's huge, and honestly, it's not even just about finding the problems, it's about preventing them in the first place.
Makes sense. So how does it do that?
Well, when you have those clear contracts defined up front, those teams can work much more effectively in parallel,
Yeah, totally, because they're not constantly second-guessing each other or worried about breaking something.
Right. Exactly. It's like having that shared blueprint that everyone can refer to so you're not tripping over each other.
I love that analogy, but I'm curious. Our source material also touches on this, the whole human element of it. How does contract testing change the way developers and testers work together?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because let's be real, those two groups haven't always seen eye to eye.
Right. But with contract testing, you're both working towards the shared goal of making sure the software meets those defined expectations.
It's like they're finally on the same team, playing from the same sheet of music.
Exactly. Less us versus them and more how do we solve this together, it can lead to a much smoother, happier development process overall.
I could see that, but realistically, it can't always be that easy.
Well, no, it does come with its own set of challenges. Our source material points out a few.
What are some of the common hurdles teams face when trying to get into contract testing?
Well, one of the big ones is getting buy-in from everyone, especially the provider teams.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine you're the provider. Suddenly you've got all these different consumers with their own expectations.
I see. It's like having a million bosses suddenly.
Yeah, and any change you make could potentially throw a wrench in someone else's code.
So communication is key here, right?
Absolutely. Transparency and collaboration are your best friends when it comes to contract testing.
It's not just about the technical stuff. It's about building that culture of shared responsibility.
100%. Now, sometimes even with the best communication, the consumer-driven approach might not be the best fit.
When would that be? Why not?
The source material mentions that it might not be ideal for things like public APIs, for example.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, with a public API, you often have tons of consumers, right? And the provider has much less control over what they're doing, how they're building their stuff.
So it's hard to keep track of everyone's expectations?
Exactly. It can become really tricky to manage compatibility without that direct line of communication,
That makes a lot of sense.
which is why we have other approaches like the bidirectional contract testing that we talked about earlier.
Right. So as a refresher, how does that work again?
Instead of the consumer just calling all the shots, the provider gets a say too.
Okay, so it's more of a two-way street this time.
Exactly. They work together to define the contract, making sure everyone's needs are met.
That seems much more collaborative.
It is, and it can be super useful in situations where, like we said, the consumer doesn't have complete control, like with a public API.
Our source material actually had this really cool example of bidirectional contract testing in action with an order consumer and a payment provider. I want to break that down for us. Okay, yeah, walk us through that.
So we've got this order consumer, right? And they need to interact with a payment provider, but it's a public API.
So no easy way for them to control how that payment provider works.
Exactly. That's where things get interesting with this bidirectional contract testing. They can't just use PACT to directly define the contract from the consumer side like they normally would.
Because they don't have all the information, right?
Yeah, they don't control the payment provider, so instead they use a mock.
A mock, like a fake payment provider.
Exactly. It simulates the real thing, lets them see how their order consumer would interact with it and define those expected requests and responses.
Ah, okay, I'm following you. That's how the consumer builds their side of the contract, right? But what about the payment provider? They must have something already in place.
They do. They're using an open API specification. It's kind of like a universal language for describing APIs, you know?
So both sides have put their expectations out there in a way that's clear, structured.
And most importantly, something that can be understood by machines.
Right, that makes sense. I'm guessing this is where the PAC broker comes back into play.
You know it. It takes both of those contracts, the one from the consumer's mock interaction and the provider's open API spec, and acts as the go-between. Checks for any mismatches.
And if everything lines up, they're good to go.
Exactly. They know their system should be able to communicate without any nasty surprises. And if there are any hiccups, any disagreements in those contracts, they'll find out early before it becomes a major problem.
Wow, this is pretty amazing. It's like having this automated compatibility checker for your software. So much better than finding out things don't work when it's already gone live.
That's the whole point. Find those integration issues early, save everyone a ton of time and headaches. Ultimately, you get better software because of it.
Absolutely. This has been eye-opening. I've learned so much about contract testing, and I know we have a ton of resources for our listeners who want to explore this even further.
Oh yeah, the source material had some great ones. The official PAC documentation is fantastic, super detailed, and there's that video series too for visual learners.
Right, and for those who really want to dive deep, there's always that new book, Contract Testing in Action.
Yes, it's written by the pros, covers everything from different approaches to best practices and implementing contract testing in your own projects.
Sounds like the ultimate guide. We'll be sure to link all these resources in the show notes. So as we wrap up this deep dive into contract testing, any final thoughts? What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
In the world of microservices and these really complex interconnected systems, contract testing isn't just a nice to have anymore. It's essential. It's your secret weapon for better collaboration, less time debugging, and ultimately delivering amazing software that your users will actually enjoy using.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been awesome chatting about contract testing with you.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time.